No longer can I get a laugh out of people by pointing out that the Green Mountain State is the only state in America that George Bush did not visit during his presidency, because people have forgotten everything now. Well, we've been talking about the Green Mountains. It's been a long trip down here today, but it's worth it, and I'm really delighted to be coming back. I come to you sort of as one of those characters that Paul Simon described, those who come in the nation's most uncertain hour and sing an American tune. The tune I'm about to sing has something to do with a song that you may remember if you've heard it before. It goes, I've got an old mule and her name is Sal. You know that song, 15 miles on the Erie Canal. She's a good old worker and a good old pal, 15 miles, which is how long you could travel in a day on the Erie Canal. We've hauled some barges in our day filled with lumber, coal, and hay, and we know every inch of the way from Albany to Buffalo. That's my part of the world, and where I grew up, that song is more or less the national anthem. Because if you draw an X across New York State, and you let the second arm of it be the Erie Canal that goes from Albany to Buffalo, where the two arms of that X cross, you'll find what's called the city of Oneida. Now, city may be a little bit generous. It's a city on the map, and it's a city in the charter. It's the city where I grew up, but it's really a town, a modest town, a little town. A town a lot smaller than Decatur, I'll tell you that. Now, on the edge of that town, probably about 5 miles, maybe 3 miles from the dead center of the town, at the edge of a cornfield, there's a cornfield on one side and there's a cow pasture on the other side, is a sign that says city limits. My wife always got a kick out of that. My wife is from the Jersey Shore, the land of Bruce Springsteen. And when she came up to join me and my parents sometimes, she would always laugh at that city limits sign way out there in the country. Well, I have a bunch of reasons for being interested in that city limits sign. One of them is that my dad was born in that farming country just beyond that sign. He was born under sort of normal circumstances, but he was the son of an itinerant day laborer and machinist and circus magician who had left Tennessee's Clinch Mountain, yes indeed, the Clinch Mountain in Tennessee, home of Ralph Stanley and the Clinch Mountain Boys. I will not sing for you tonight, however. He had left the Clinch Mountain in order to start a new family in upstate New York. He had left, alas, without benefit of a divorce from his old wife, but that's another story for another day. My mom's family, on the other hand, came from town. They were the other side of that city limits sign, and she was descended from people who traced their origins all the way back to William Howard Taft, who, as you probably know, was not only America's fattest president, but also was the only one to do double duty as Chief Justice. So you can see between that Clinch Mountain connection and William Howard Taft why I was so interested in that city limit sign and what things it might seem to mark and what distinctions it might seem to make. And that brings me to this novel called Kings of the Earth. It's a story of 3 illiterate and very eccentric brothers who lived together on a dirt farm just down the road from the place where my dad was born. It's about 3 brothers who lived and worked together all their lives long on this one hard patch of ground and slept together in the same bed in this one poor ramshackle house until one summer morning when one of them doesn't wake up. The story is told by a chorus of voices, the brothers themselves. They're the Proctor brothers, and I'll tell you now, I call them the Proctor brothers because my dad's mother's maiden name was Proctor. So I wanted people to know the claim that these poor guys have on me. Audie, Creed, and Vernon are their names. The story is also told by their neighbor, a gentleman named Preston Hatch, told by the investigating state police, various other friends and neighbors and interested parties. And the story moves back and forth in time in what I like to think of and hope comes across as the manner of memory and reminiscence. It covers most of the 20th century before it's over, and it begins with Audie, the middle brother, the most, what's the word I should use, the most dependent of the 3, waking up to find his brother dead. It's 1990. And Audie says, my brother Vernon went on ahead. I woke up and felt for him, but the bed was dry, and my brother Creed was already up. He had his overalls on, and he was telling me that I had to get up too because it was after 4:30 and the cows wouldn't wait. The bed was cold, but it was dry. My brother Vernon was still in it, and he was cold like the bed was since he had gone on. That left me here with Creed. It made me the oldest. Preston picks up the story. I wouldn't have been surprised if we'd lost the both of them at the same time. Vernon and Audie, I mean. That's how close they've been ever since they were boys. Vernon would lead the way, and Audie would follow right along behind. Not that they were two peas in a pod, not by any means. Vernon was the brains of the operation, and Audie had problems, has problems. I was sitting in the kitchen with my coffee, and down the hill, Creed opened the barn door the way he always does, first thing, but instead of opening it and looking at the day and then going right back in, he kept coming. I've known those boys since they were boys. I've lived right here alongside their place since the 30s, and they've always run in the same track. Everything goes the same today as it went yesterday. That's how it is around a farm. A farm is the master of you and not the other way around. So when Creed opened the barn door and came out and kept on coming instead of going back in, I knew something wasn't right. I believe I stood up at the kitchen table and said so to Margaret. I said, Margaret, something isn't right. He was coming across the field toward our place, and I guessed by how he was coming that it would be a good idea to go out and meet him halfway if I could. I put my coffee cup down, and I went out on the porch, and then I came back in to put my coat on because it was cooler outdoors than I'd thought. I guessed I might be out there for a while anyway. Creed had on that old wool coat of his that's torn up the back and covered all over with cow manure. It's either his coat or Vernon's. I can never remember. They all swap things around. It's the way they were brought up. Anyway, he was wearing the wool coat. That house of theirs doesn't have anything much in the way of insulation, so they probably have a better idea of the weather outdoors than we do. That's why I had to go back in for a coat of my own. Outdoors is no different from indoors for them, except outdoors there's more breeze and it smells a little better, even in the barnyard. I don't know if he slept in that coat or not, but he might have. That poor old boy looked like he was about to have a heart attack, and I was glad I'd gone out so he didn't have to keep coming up the hill. Vernon died in the night, he said. He was shaking a little, like he was about to have a fit. I'm no doctor, but that's how it seemed. A doctor might tell you something else, or put it another way. My brother's awful cold, he said. So we went down. I got him turned back around, and we went down the hill and in through the barn. The house has just the one room that they use. Audie was on the floor, and Vernon was in the bed. I wouldn't say he was cold, but he wasn't much better than room temperature. It seemed to me he was stiffening up some. Creed didn't seem to mind my touching him, but I minded it enough for both of us. I've been around death enough that it ought not to bother me, but now that I'm getting nearer to it myself, it's different. It's different for an old man. Audie was the one who needed a hand. He was curled up in a ball in his long johns, and he was shaking all over like he was freezing to death, moving all over, every part of him, the way his brother Creed had done outdoors, but worse. Audie will do that some anyhow, just as a regular thing, but this was worse than usual. I said his name, and he didn't say anything back. I got down on my hands and knees in front of him, and I looked at him hard, and I said his name louder. I made an effort to kind of bark it, the way Vernon used to when he wanted to get his attention. I slapped the floor with the flat of my hand, and a cloud of dust rose up, and I got a splinter, but never mind that. He heard me, and his eyes popped open wide, and he looked at me like he'd seen a ghost, or like I was a ghost, and he was looking straight through me at something else, maybe at Vernon, up there on the bed. Audie's pretty near blind, and one of his eyes is clouded over some, but I've never seen anything so blue. Audie. When I came out to the front porch, they were turning. A little wind had come up, and they were all faced in the same direction, and they were turning. I couldn't see them all that clear, but I could hear every one separate. They all make a different sound, every one. I didn't make them that way on purpose, but that's how they come out. They can't help it, and I couldn't help it either. They come out how they come out. Vernon says they're like children that way. They were turning in the little wind, and I listened to them turn, and I felt some better. Now, the brothers have a younger sister. Her name is Donna. She's a nurse. And it was Margaret who thought to call the sister. Margaret Hatch, who watched from her kitchen window as her husband walked down the hill between the houses and who'd kept watching when he didn't come back. Margaret, who'd watched as the sun came up and the shadow of her house gathered itself and pushed down the hill to poke at the Proctor boys' barn, and who'd moved with her coffee out onto the screen porch to keep on watching as the shadow withdrew a little and the heat of the day began to rise and the state trooper's patrol car came roaring up the dirt lane. She figured the boys' telephone must work or else they couldn't have called the troopers, but she didn't figure that they would think to call Donna. She was right. She looked up at the number and stood in the kitchen and dialed. She wished she had a cigarette, and the idea of it surprised her completely. She hadn't smoked since Harry Truman, but she thought that right now a cigarette might be just the thing to calm her nerves. The house smelled like cow manure and dry rot and spoiled food, like tobacco and burnt rope and rat droppings, like old men and sickness and death. Del Graham was the state trooper, the captain, and he arrived first. He walked past the old man who sat rocking on the porch with his long white beard pooling in his lap and his hands knotted over his hairless skull, and he went through the open front door as into a mouthful of rotted teeth, the disarray and the stink, the order and the purposefulness gone to no use in the end. Creed was sitting at the table alongside the neighbor, Hatch, Preston Hatch, who'd made the call. The telephone was on the table between them. They sat composed on either side of it like a formal double portrait, titans of industry, awaiting a message from some distant outpost of commerce. The telephone was solid black, square and heavy, all business. The cord that connected it to the wall was wrapped in a kind of woven material that Graham didn't remember having seen for a long time. It looped easily and snake-like in spite of its age, and although it was frayed in places, it looked made to last. The telephone was the old-fashioned kind with a dial, rotary phones they called them, and the numbers under the dial were either worn away from use or obscured by dirt. He figured the second. Either way, in the absence of numbers, a person would need to count in order to make a phone call. Graham guessed that such a telephone probably didn't get much use, considering it was a conduit to a world that had no business here. Among the other voices that tell the story is that of Del Graham. I was lucky enough in the recording of the audiobook, little backstory here, I had auditioned to read Finn, and I didn't get the job. So don't think that things always go a guy's way, you know what I mean? But I auditioned for the part of Del Graham. He's a man of middle age, moderate intelligence, good intention, and somehow I seemed to fit the part. So I was lucky enough to be able to read Del's part in the audiobook. Here he is, a bit later in the book, but he's reflecting on that early time. I hated like anything to see them go put up that yellow tape. I knew it had to be done, but I hated to see it happen, and I hated that I couldn't do anything to prevent it. You reach a point, though, beyond which it's all procedure. Some men take comfort in that, but I don't. Maybe I will one day, but I don't now. What were they going to find? These three men lived there cheek by jowl all their lives, and the place hadn't been cleaned in forever. There were fingerprints on the headboard older than I am. If you looked hard enough, you'd find fingerprints of dead people. And I don't mean Vernon either. I mean the old couple. What were their names? Lester and Ruth? The parents. The only evidence, if you could call it that, was on the body. I never noticed it myself, but I'm no doctor. The sister didn't notice it either, even though I had her look. At least she didn't say. The medical examiner did his job, though, and what I took for sunburn turned out, in his opinion, to be sunburn, and something else on top of that, or rather underneath it, burst blood vessels. Petechiae is the word he used. The blood vessels break from pressure, which can indicate asphyxiation, strangling. You'd see them on the cheeks and on the neck and in the eyeballs, and Vernon had them in all three places. I don't know. Maybe they can burst from coughing, too. as I understand it. Maybe a million other things. It's plain that Vernon was not a well man to begin with, so I don't know. I think you'd have to have more than that to go on. But the medical examiner saw what he saw, and they had to go out there and put up that yellow tape, regardless of what I thought. It was procedure, plain and simple. Now, some people in Kings never leave the farm, and some do, and some leave and atavistically are drawn back one way or another. You already heard about Donna, the sister who's gone to nursing school. She lives in town. She has a husband, D'Alton, who's a milking machine salesman. I love that name, D'Alton. When I worked in my dad's factory when I was in college, I knew a guy named D'Alton. Never known another one, but there you go. Her husband's name is D'Alton, and she has a son named Tom. Tom works construction. Or he worked construction, anyhow, until he discovered that, contrary to his earlier opinions when he was a child, he hated to go out to his uncle's farm. It scared him. The animals scared him. He was frightened of the dirt and the filth, and it was horrible. And then basically he was me visiting my dad's uncle's farm when I was a little kid. He hated it. But when he grew up, he decided that it actually was probably the best place he could ever find to grow a secret crop of marijuana. So Tom is back. Tom is back. And his father isn't on yet to what he's up to. He ultimately does get on to what Tom is up to. But he isn't yet. Actually, where this scene takes place is there are a lot of lakes in upstate New York, and Tom lives down by the lake. It's a summer place mainly, and there are tourist traps of all kinds all around it. A lot of restaurants and so on for summer people. And there's one of them in particular where his father likes to go. It's called the Landlubber Lounge. The Landlubber Lounge at Harpoon Gary's. It was caved in at noon, lit mainly by some strings of Christmas lights worked into dusty fishing nets that drooped down from the ceiling over the bar. The lights blinked every now and then, making the broken fiberglass lobsters and the big satanic plastic crabs suspended up there loom like props from an old science fiction movie. Revenge of the appetizers. D'Alton sat studying them and nursing his summer drink, a rum and coke. He hated this place. He hated all these places at the beach. But it was far enough from home that nobody he knew ever saw him come in, and nobody he knew ever saw him leave. Donna didn't like him having a drink, not ever. He figured that it must have something to do with her old man, even though she'd been only, 3 or 4 years old when he'd finally bought it. It was cold in the lounge, and it was no warmer in the sunlit dining room when he finished his drink and went out there to sit down and order himself a sandwich. They'd serve at the bar. Those plastic lobsters and crabs just gave him the creeps, so he sat all by himself at a square formica table with an advertising placemat on it, looking through the picture windows over the beach. He had a little buzz from the rum and coke, and that was enough to last him. He turned down a menu and asked the waitress for an iced tea and a club sandwich on white toast, light on the mayonnaise. The lunchtime crowd began to trickle in. People with flip-flops and damp cover-ups and the shapes of their wet bathing suits soaking through the shorts and T-shirts. Not one of them working, not today. Not like D'Alton Poole, who had places to go as soon as that club sandwich came and he got it eaten and cleared himself out of there. He tried to remember the last time he'd taken a day off, and he couldn't. Other than Saturdays and Sundays, which he had to admit even to himself was a better deal than he would have gotten if he'd stayed around his old man's onion farm. Still, the life of a milking machine salesman was not exactly paradise. The sandwich came, and he opened it up to check the mayonnaise and put it back together. He picked up the iced tea and held that up to the picture windows to see if the sugar had settled out, and he put it down and stirred it again. That was when he noticed his own son sitting out on the beach in a lawn chair. He had his back to him and his shirt off, but it was Tom all right, sitting there taking the sun and smoking a cigarette and fishing around in a foam cooler for a beer. On a Tuesday. How dare he? Wasn't he supposed to be working construction somewhere? He finished his sandwich and got a free refill on the iced tea and mixed in some sugar and sat nursing it, cleaning up the last of his potato chips, keeping an eye on his son through the window and checking out a 20-something girl who'd come into the dining room with her bikini soaking through a USA for Africa t-shirt like an X-ray. He couldn't help himself. She caught on after a while and shot him a look. And although he would have sat for longer if he could, he figured right then it was time to ask for the check. He was due at a farm over in Peterborough in an hour or so, He didn't need that long to get there. He paid his check and he went out into the parking lot and followed a little sandy trail full of footprints over to the beach. It was hot in the sun, so he took off his sport coat, and the sun on his bare forearms was even hotter. He thought about the Bedouins, or whatever they were, those wandering tribes in the desert, and how every time you saw pictures of them, they were all covered up like that Lawrence of Arabia. It made sense when you thought about it. He put on his sport coat again and walked over to where Tom sat, sinking into the sand as he went, getting his shoes all filled up. "Hey, sonny boy, catching some rays?" His voice came out louder than he meant it to. "Hey." Tom turned around in the folding chair, all nonchalant, but with the look of a high school kid caught with a cigarette in the boys' room. D'Alton hardly knew where to start. The lassitude, the beer, the 15 or 20 cigarette butts arrayed in the sand alongside the folding chair like ruins in the desert. He made his decision and nodded down toward the butts, acknowledging them as evidence of Tom's having been sitting out here for a while. "That Fazio's giving you an extra long lunch hour, is that it?" What was Tom supposed to say? "I'm not working for Fazio anymore." "How long's this been going on?" "A while now." "You didn't tell me." "I didn't think I had to." D'Alton pushed the toe of his loafer against the folding chair. "Move," he said. Tom did. He vacated the chair and sat down on the lid of the foam cooler, not quite putting his whole weight on it. D'Alton took the chair. He settled in and folded his hands behind his neck, leaned his head back. "Now this," he said, "is living." Tom indicated the cooler. "You want a beer?" "You kidding?" said D'Alton with his eyes shut against the sun. "I gotta work. Don't distract me from my point. Like I said, this is living." "I know. You got it all figured out if you can do this on a Tuesday afternoon." Tom leaned forward. "Look, I'm making money. I'm paying my bills. You want more than that?" "You're not working for the Italians, are you?" "Not hardly. The Italians with the suits, I mean, not that big fat dope Fazio." "No, I'm not working for any Italians." "Good. I don't want you running numbers or something like that. You want to do that, you get a job over at Vernon Downs. You get a square job." "I'm not running numbers. I don't even know what numbers are." "Good." He checked his watch. "Keep it that way." He considered the time and decided, what the hell? That farmer over in Peterborough could wait. He towed the foam cooler again. On second thought, he said, "How about giving your old man one of those nice cold beers you got?" We've met Preston before. Preston, the neighbor. Preston, who spends his time now basically looking after the brothers, the Proctor brothers. Preston has been there since the 30s, as I think I remember he said in something that I read. He moved out there because his father, who had a lumber yard in town, didn't have many customers, and he put his people to work and used up what stock he had building a house out in the country. So Preston came from the town and still, for most of his life, worked in the town, ran his dad's lumber yard until his dad died, and ultimately Preston retired. He's not working now except to keep an eye on the Proctor brothers and on Tom. As you can imagine, Tom on the farm with marijuana and with his uncle Vernon, who is suffering and ultimately will die from something that may be cancer in his throat or God knows what, might make for a potent combination. Preston says this: "Tom was in the hayloft, and the rest of us were on the porch, and Vernon was saying how his throat hurt. He had a sack of horehound drops that he sucked on when he wasn't chewing tobacco. He'd take them one right after another. I don't believe they helped even the slightest little bit. I think he knew that, but I guess he always hoped for the placebo effect. He had his left hand in his lap, and he was rolling up little pellets of stuffing from the chair with his right hand, and when he wasn't rubbing it, the place on his leg when the tooth from the harrow went in. They say Audie has a nervous problem, but it runs straight through that whole family. There isn't one of them could keep still if you put him on the payroll for it. We knew when Tom came down because we heard his car doors open and shut. First one door, and then a little wait, and then the other. He was fooling with something in the car. Vernon said he hoped Tom would come around to the porch and pay his respects before he went on home, on account of he was tired and he didn't want to get up. He said he'd just as soon sit right there, and if that no-good nephew of his didn't see fit to bother coming around, then so be it. They all could do without. But after a few minutes, Tom did come around. He had a little plastic bag, and he put it on Vernon's lap. and Vernon gave him a look like it was trick or treat. I had a suspicion about that bag, but I didn't know for sure, not then. When Tom told his uncle he ought to be careful since that right there was a good $15 worth, I knew. Creed knew the same. If that's $15 worth, he said, I don't know why I've been fooling with feed corn. Words to that effect. You couldn't blame him. Vernon asked if he could chew it, because he didn't care much for smoking anymore, and Tom said that wasn't how most people used it. He didn't know if chewing it would work or not, but he couldn't make any promises, and since that little bag was worth a good $15 worth of anybody's money, why take chances with it? Most folks either smoked it or made brownies. Vernon said he wasn't much good in the kitchen, so he thought he'd just stick with the regular way. Tom had some papers in his pocket, and he gave them to him, and then he left. I'd heard that before about the brownies, but I'd always thought they were just pulling my leg. It turned out it was true. Now, Vernon would sit on the porch as time went by and smoke his marijuana, big as life, twice as foolish. I was over there once or twice while he was at it. He said Tom had told him not to do it in the yard, but he figured the porch would be all right. A man's home is his castle, he said. What a man does in his own home is nobody's business. His brothers nodded their heads at that, like a bunch of old sages, the three wise men. We sat out there one afternoon, I remember, and one night. It was late, but there was a breeze still. Vernon wound up a little cigarette, and Creed put a chaw of Red Man in his cheek, and Audie asked for a little of the Red Man, too, rather than be left out. They were all three of them going at it. Audie was whittling, too, even though it was too dark to see. His vision was going away. You could hear the knife. They say a marijuana cigarette smells like rope, but I think it smells more like a muskmelon. Kind of sweet and mossy, but with a little spike to it. It's a nice enough smell, if I'm allowed to say that. Not that I'd ever think of taking it up myself. After a little while, I asked Vernon if he'd started seeing things yet, and he laughed at me. He said, you don't see things. He said it wasn't like that. He kept on laughing like he had one over on old Preston Hatch. I guess he did. He was the expert. He was regular Timothy Leary in that crowd. It did seem to relax him some and make him talk a little more. He didn't suck on those whorehound drops when he was smoking it. Maybe his throat didn't bother him so much. We sat there in the dark, and he started humming something. I couldn't believe my ears. I don't think I ever heard a note of music out of those boys. Not so much as a whistle. I used to play a little tenor banjo myself, but in the Proctor house, music wasn't a useful enough thing to waste your time on. I heard Vernon kind of humming now, though, in spite of that catch he had way down in his throat. The catch in his throat made it buzz a little. What he was humming sounded like a lullaby, something I suppose he'd have learned from his mother. I guess he had to go that far back to come up with something. You use what you have. We all do. We all sat quiet. Audie stopped scraping his knife. There were headlights out on the main road. The whirligigs turned in the little wind from across the pasture. Kings of the earth. Well, I'll be. I should have stopped earlier. Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate your coming here tonight. And this is the time in these events where people usually have questions. I did a reading one time. Actually, it wasn't a reading. It was a call into a phone call into a book group. A lot of book groups tend to be populated by women. This group was populated by men, and they were a tough crowd. And I called in, and the first question was, those of you who have read Finn might understand this question. As you already heard tonight, it was a very dark, grim, dark, alcohol and blood saturated story. And the first question I got was, what's wrong with you? And I handed the phone to my wife. I said, yeah, talk to my wife. I don't know. I can't explain anything. She's been married to me for 34 years. So there we go. That means, I guess, that's sort of my shorthand way of saying there's no such thing as an unfair question. And if you have any questions, I would love to hear them, or entertain them, as they say, or entertain you. Yes. This is a really good question.
No, you're very good at describing the way the guy answers his leg.
We see the scene earlier where the tooth from the spike tooth arrow goes through Creed's the thick part of his. Yeah, he has a limp the whole rest of the book.
Everyone knows a guy like that, but it's always.
Yeah, and he's nervous. He's got little things going. Kind of two different questions there, really. And yeah, he sits on this old overstuffed chair, and one of the things he does is he pulls out little bits of the stuffing and he makes them into pellets and he flicks them because that's that's a little tick that he has, and everybody has ticks. These guys have several. But I think in some measure, little things like that, tiny bits of observation, are what make something come to life more than anything else. And you really have to see it in your brain in order, as Eddie Izzard said, in my mind, before you really have to envision it. One of the lines that for some reason both my editor and my second reader, they just loved the idea that when D'Alton was eating, when his sandwich came, he opened it up to check the mayonnaise. Because people do that, it's just one of those things. So those kind of details only happen, I think, when you're really paying attention to that dream in your mind. The other way they happen is it's part of a real commitment to make people behave in space and with weight, if you know what I mean. When somebody steps on a porch, you better be able to, feel the weight of his foot on the step and what kind of a porch it is, if it's important in any way. So those things are really important to me. And people used to say to me and they still do about Finn, they say, how much time did you spend along the Mississippi to get all that stuff right? And I say, well, I grew up about a quarter of a mile from the Erie Canal, and that's sort of it. But it's a matter of imagination and vividness. The other question about this book got composed in a peculiar way. I've written a lot of novels. Finn and King's are the only two that you will see. The others either weren't good enough before or weren't good enough in between, and I finished them or almost finished them, but just withdrew them from consideration or whatever. Even though I have only two out there, I have a lot of experience with different ways of writing failures. The way that King's worked out for me, I wanted it to have a kind of a shifting, I wanted it to have to shift around in time, which it does. Begins in 1990, stutters around through a long period of time that goes back to 1930 and ends again in 1990. I wanted to have it told by a wide variety of voices, and the reason for that, I'm beginning to realize, is probably the same reason that Mark Twain wrote Huckleberry Finn when he was about my age, which is that you begin to fall in love with the voices that you grew up with, and you start to think about them, and they start to kind of haunt you in some ways. And I wanted to get them down. So I knew those things from the beginning. But what I did was kind of methodical. I set down an outline for everybody in the book and for America in the book that runs from about 1930 until 1990 and plots absolutely everything that was happening in the book relative to other things happening in the book and to relative other things like the Korean War and the Vietnam War and so on. And then I started with Audie because I wanted to start with that moment with the dead man in the bed. And I shifted to Preston because that made sense, because he would be the one who would be coming to their rescue. And from then on, it was really a matter of letting those characters, and one more thing. I decided up front which characters would be permitted to roam around this sounds really complicated, to roam around in time, like Preston, because he's been there since the 30s, can tell stories from the deep past. Audie doesn't, because he wasn't, his consciousness was different. Other people talk only about what's happening right now. D'Alton is a character who narrates his own first-person things, and I will read you his first one, or a little bit of it. If I can find it, when D'Alton talks, I can't find it. We only overhear him. He's talking to somebody else. And usually he's trying to sell them something, or he's trying to sell himself to them in some way. So he's only overheard. So there are all kinds of different parameters I set up. But after those parameters got set up and the nature of the characters and their relationships, from then on, I just let it go. And Preston would remind me of something that Audie might want to talk about, which would remind me of something that somebody else might want to talk about. And the rest of the process was very organic. I don't get, on paper, I get authority to sort of okay voices, but really, I guess I probably would have okayed myself if I had all that authority. You know? That may be all the answer that we need. The fellow who read Finn, I have mixed feelings about the performance, but a lot of people I talk to absolutely love it. So that's probably just because it isn't the way it sounds in my head. But I will tell you, he's a real nice guy. He's an actor named Ed Sala. He, believe it or not, he spent a couple, maybe 5 summers ago, up near where I live in Plymouth, Vermont, doing summer stock at the theater in Weston, Vermont, which is a beautiful little village. They have a beautiful summer stock program there, a great little theater. And this was about 2 years before he recorded the Finn audiobook. And we were reminiscing about his period up there and how he enjoyed it and how lucky I am to live there. And I said, "What were you in anyway at the Weston Playhouse?" And he said, "I was in Big River. I played Pap Finn." It's like, whoa, pretty funny. So there's that. He reads one of the voices in Kings. I haven't heard Kings yet. I've only heard my own parts and some other bits. He does one of the voices. I don't know whom. The guy who does Preston is magnificent. I don't know who the reader is, but he's really good. And I feel good about what I've heard of that. I don't get, in other words, a lot of say-so over all that. I do get other things, but not that.
Does your editor get involved in making the choice, or someone else in the publisher?
Actually, in my case, the audiobook is published by someone other than Random House. It comes from Recorded Books, and I know the producer, and we all like each other a bunch, and she was really glad when I finally qualified for one because I must have looked so disappointed last time. But at any rate, I trust them to do a good job, and as far as I can see, I mean, they really. The cool thing about audiobooks is that they have to read every word exactly as it is on the page. When you don't really think about that. But Ed, who read Finn, afterwards was saying to me, usually, John, when you read an audiobook, and he reads a lot of them, usually it takes you, I said, how long did it take you? He said, well, it usually takes you exactly twice as long as the finished product. So if it's a 10-hour audiobook, it takes you 20 hours to read it. Finn is a 10-hour audiobook. It took him 40 hours to read because the sentences were so long and they're so complicated, and by the time he got to the end of one, he realized that he'd put the wrong emphasis way back at the beginning, and it was quite an adventure for poor Ed. The title. Well, you probably are aware, and if I wasn't, I would be now, of the biblical dimension of the phrase "kings of the earth." Maybe you're not. Well, what you have to do is do what I do. See, as a writer, I have set up what's called Google Alerts, and they look for things, and then they tell me when I get a nice review or whatever. But I had to stop the one that was just for kings of the earth because crazy people are always talking about, fanatics of all types are talking about how the end of the world is coming and the kings of the earth have something to do with it. There's a particular line somewhere in Revelations, which is the one I knew, although there are others, describing the kings of the earth hiding in their caves at the end times, and talking, the idea being that and this is how it happens, both Old Testament and New, the kings of the earth are generally set up against the king of heaven. So the small kings, the kings of planetary, physical, temporal reality, are the kings of the earth. And I believe these guys are the kings of the earth. I mean, they are rooted to it. They grew up from it. And I don't mean any insult to them by that. So I wanted it to have that big biblical dimension. Even if you didn't remember it, it might be one of those things that would kind of resonate. It's because it sounds that way. And I also wanted to have it be respectful and unironic, if that's a word. I sound like Preston. If that's a word is one of the things he says. things about, I wanted to be an unironic statement of their place in the world. The voices thing is an interesting one. Preston's voice in particular is a voice from upstate New York. We have our own way of speaking up there, as we all do, wherever it is that we come from. And people, when I wrote Finn and would travel around, they would say, well, I don't hear any dialect in this book. I mean, Huckleberry Finn was a book that was all dialect, and Finn was a book shockingly absent of dialect. There was no dialect in the dialogue whatsoever. And people would say, well, why didn't you write dialect? And I would say, well, I didn't want to fail, for one thing. I just didn't want to do it wrong. I didn't want to be put up against Mark Twain and be found wanting. On the other hand, when it came time to do Kings of the Earth, to me, part of the wisdom of this book, if it has wisdom, and I'd like to think it does, part of what I meant by the intelligence putting it together was to arrange on a stage people who could talk to each other, and people who could remind each other of things, and people who could see things differently and learn from each other. And those people spoke in voices with inflections and sentence structures and words that I remembered. I was really happy last night. Sometime last evening, I got an email from my uncle, not on my dad's side. This is on the William Howard Taft side, and he would tell you that it's the William Howard Taft side. He's a retired Methodist minister in upstate New York, and the first sentence of his email was that he could hear those old voices too. And then he went on to say that he remembered the old countryman in upstate New York who talked just this way. And I thought, my God, maybe I did get it right. Or else he's my uncle and he loves me. You know, that could be, or it could be a little of both. But I wanted to honor that. I mean, the dedication is to my parents for all these old voices. And it's the voices in which they told me the stories of their childhood as well. And that's their voices. It didn't take long. No. And that's how I knew that it was going well, that it was going right. I'm a very meticulous, I'm very meticulous, which is to say that if I work from, probably about 5 or 7, I write for probably 5 hours a day, and I maybe produce 1,500 words during the course of that time, but they're finished words. I don't just drum stuff out and then fix it later, because I can't leave it unfixed. So I'm meticulous, but I'm also very disciplined, which is to say I do it every day, and I grind the stuff out. But on the other hand, all that said, if it's not going right, it takes me longer. And it's very simple. I mean, I've just learned that as time has gone by. Finn took 3 months, which was crazy because I was working full-time at the time. And luckily, thanks to Finn, I work full-time doing this now, which is even better. But this took full-time 5.5 months. And, that's not a lot of time for this. There are guys who turn stuff out faster, but that's the length. There was the question about first and third. I hadn't done any first at all before. I had written a short novel in first person. The second second novel I wrote was in first person. It was kind of interesting, and it was it was okay. But I decided doing this one, that I wanted to get those voices out there. I wanted to let those people talk to each other. I wanted to let them be heard. But at the same time, this may seem terrible, but there were two things at play. One was that I'll tell you the good one first. The good one is that I really wanted to provide an alternative kind of understanding of the material. As opposed, sort of an authoritative set of voices. And there are 3, this is going to sound so complicated. Please buy a copy and read it for yourself, but it sounds so complicated. There are 3 third-person narrators as well. There's one that's tied to Tom, and that voice is very modern. That's the voice that you heard when the story about D. Alton in the restaurant. And then there's a voice that's tied to his mother, Donna, and that's a little bit more old-fashioned. And then there's a voice that's tied to his grandmother, Ruth, and that's a very old-fashioned voice. In fact, it's a lot like the voice of Finn. It's very biblical sounding. It's very deep and resonant and authoritative. I wanted to be able to have those three points of view on the subject too. And one critic, I don't know who it was, kind of sharply, I think, observed that, and I don't mean sharply like pointedly, but observed that having those other voices saved me from having to have the first-person characters kind of dumping information somewhere. And I think he's probably right about that. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but I think it was a good function. The other reason is that I really had this kind of, it was this kind of feeling that I wanted to, it was kind of perverse really, I wanted to do every difficult, tricky, complicated thing in the book. I wanted to have 10 first-person narrators, 3 different third-person narrators. I wanted to shift time. I wanted to do all this stuff, yet I wanted at the end to make it completely invisible. I wanted to make it go away. Just as in Finn, I wanted to write, the big secret of Finn is that really I wanted to write a thriller. But I wanted to write a thriller that was told in and used the materials of and came to the conclusions of literary fiction. But I wanted to write a page turner and see if I could do that. So here I wanted to do everything complicated and then make people forget about it. And I hope I kind of succeeded. I hope. We'll see. So far, so good. I read there. I was at one of my favorite T-shirts is the Decatur Book Festival T-shirt from a couple, 3 years ago. It was fun. I met really nice people here. Not just not only natives, but other writers. There were two of my buddies I met there. Wayne Caldwell, who wrote Catalucci. Ever read that? Has a new book out. Wayne's a great guy, and a local guy, Tom Mullen. I saw him up here. Tom was going to come tonight, but his 3-month-old got a stomach bug from his 4-year-old, or something like that. So poor Tom is not here, but I like him anyway. I've thrown away 2 things so far. I'll tell you what they are. One was a great story, inspired by a true story in upstate New York. King's actually was inspired by a true story of 4 brothers, not 3 brothers. It was set on, the Oneida Indians are up there, and there's an Indian reservation that now has a great big casino and all that kind of stuff. But it was a story set on a conflict between the town and the Indians. And another one was set up there too, and because I'm kind of feeling that that's a place where I need to write about. But I'm onto something new, and I think it's going to be a good one. And I actually mentioned one of the main characters earlier when I was kind of describing my own personal background, the story of my father's dad, who left Clinch Mountain and wandered some, and then ended up starting a whole new family up here. And my dad ended up, when he was about my age, getting a telephone call from a woman in Tennessee saying, "Hello, Warren, you have a half-sister." So that was an interesting thing, and that may be where I'm headed. It's so sad, isn't it? It's like the Island of Lost Toys. They just go away. And later I realized that it was probably a good idea. My wife and I are so happy that I withdrew the last book because it wasn't as good as King's, and it wouldn't have served me well. And I find there's no way that I can re-enter them, unfortunately. There are a couple that I almost wanted to, or I did want to. One in particular, I mentioned that I grew up in Oneida, New York. You all have probably heard of the Oneida Silver Company. What you may not know, unless you were a history buff in some measure, or a sex and religion buff, is that the Oneida Silverware Company was founded as the Oneida Community, which was a utopian community formed in 1840 or 1842 by a guy named John Humphrey Noyes. John Humphrey Noyes' great-great-grandson, Jeff Noyes, taught me how to play the 5-string banjo when I was 16 years old. And knew the guy very well. I used to play in a... Actually, the band I played in with him appears in this book. We called ourselves Margaret Sanger's Rhythm Boys after Margaret Sanger's pioneer work in birth control. And then then there was a period when we called ourselves Luke and the Smoky Mountain Boys, and every night somebody else got to be Luke. So Luke and the Smoky Mountain Boys appear here. But there was a story about the Oneida community, which was a pretty grim place in a lot of ways. Noyes was a coeval of Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism. It all kind of happened at the same time and in the same place. It just didn't take that same way. So they're all on the hard drive, but nobody will see them. I just keep them quiet. And when my wife and my daughter, whose opinions I value more than anything else in the world, tell me, not really working, I know. I fight it a little bit, and then I put it aside and try something else.
We want to thank Jon, and
Thank you.